So welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Sandler and how Sandler engages corporate organizations, their sales teams, their business development efforts, and some of the challenges they face when really growing their organization. If leadership's not on board, it never works.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about that, because I think this is a really, really important conversation from a leadership perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's kind of like, dropping your kids off at daycare, right? And sometimes we can't control what happens at home. So, tell us a little bit about why leadership would be important.
So when we think about the Sandler tactics and strategies, they're 180 degrees from anything that we see kind of a typical salesperson do. And so what I've discovered in my tenure is when leadership's not on board and they hear something different, they hear a salesperson approach a conversation a little bit differently than they've historically had before, you don't even have to say anything. Mm-hmm. It could actually just be their physiology.
Right. And
all of a sudden that salesperson goes, okay, I'm never doing that again. Right. And they undo a lot of the structure and the tactics that we're trying to really execute.
Right.
The other piece, the leadership has to understand at an intimate level what Sandler is, what the tactics and strategies, and the psychology behind it. If they're not on the same page as the business development team, it just never works. And we often talk about behavior at Sandler being a really big factor.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how does Sandler view behavior inside of organizations and really the accountability side, right? Because nothing happens inside of any organization until something gets sold.
Yeah, and I think that's a really cool thing, Rob, you bring up, right? Most sales training methodologies that organizations might use really focus on sort of that conversational intelligence, or the what, right? It's kind of like we have a discovery meeting, we have a follow-up meeting, we get technical people involved, and sort of there's this linear progression of the conversation. But what most people don't realize is that behavior drives everything, right? Without behavior, there is no pipeline, right? There is no conversations that happen. And so, we really look at behavior, and people have to drive behavior, right? We always say your conviction in the conversation is proportional to the size of your pipeline. And without behavior, we don't have that. And so when we start to drive accountability, this is why I love some of the tech tools that are out there today. CRM adoption, while it still isn't great for some organizations, the technology inside CRMs is fantastic, and it's really moving the dials, allowing people to have insight into actual measurable behaviors, where we can start to see, do they have enough behavior to fill the pipeline? If they don't, right, maybe there's a course correct opportunity. And tell us a little bit about the difference between ongoing reinforcement and impact training, because I think that's a big misnomer in this world. I mean, I took a golf lessons one time, and it made a big impact on me for about 4 days, and then the rush was over, and I was back to my old way. So tell us a little bit about impact training versus reinforcement.
Yeah, impact training. Not that the impact training is bad. We're just going to put an asterisk on it. We might get an uptick in, behavior, maybe some different techniques being utilized, but if we don't use it, we lose it. And I think that's the danger with impact training. Mm-hmm. And at Sandler, one of our core philosophies is we believe in incremental training over time. Mm-hmm. If our team, we're really going to change the sales culture of our organization, we have to keep the participants engaged over a significant amount of time. So typical engagement, corporate engagement's 2 years.
2 years.
With the ability for that organization to renew at the same kind of level they are. So, Rick, proof's in the pudding. Right? When we're thinking about, how does Sandler impact an organization? How does an organization actually know if it's working?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really fair question at a number of levels. When we look at things like return on investment, And all that can be a little bit fuzzy because markets move, right? And we can't
Sure.
control how the markets move. We can't be with our salespeople on every sales call. So there's a lot of factors in that. But ultimately, when we start to lean in, and I've said before that Sandler really is a standard that allows us for continuous improvement. When somebody can legitimately say, "Here's what went wrong. Here's how I can fix it, and here's how I'm going to prevent it from happening again." Now we know they have it. Ultimately, as well, when we start to look at these principles, our sales leaders should all be Sandler certified. And new sales leaders, newly minted sales leaders should also be Sandler certified, so we at least know that they have a baseline of the concepts and theories to work from. But ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. Are we moving the dial? I mean, we can look at things like conversion rates. We can look at margin improvements. We can look at pipeline hygiene. But ultimately, it's, do they understand where their problems are? Because nobody's perfect, and how can they fix that? By using the Sandler language.
Mm-hmm. And from maybe some of the other folks inside the organization that might be forward facing in terms of client interaction, customer interaction, does it make sense to train them too?
So I kind of look at it this way, Rob. It's, I come out of the manufacturing space.
Sure.
And I years ago, I got involved in this thing called ISO 9000. Which, ISO 9000 is the backbone quality system for most organizations, right? It's documented work instructions. And no matter what your position on the field is in an organization, you are required to understand all of those work instructions, at least at a cursory level, right? You understand, what the operator out in the warehouse goes through, because it's documented. You can go right to the book and check it out. And so when we're talking about cultural change, right, challenging the status quo within an organization to help them scale their business, it would be incumbent upon the entire organization to, at some level, have everybody navigate through some Sandler workshops for sure. Obviously, there's going to be power users. Right?
Sure.
Those are our frontline salespeople, our sales leaders, all going to be power users. And then there's the need to know people who are more sort of not necessarily forward facing. Keeping on this corporate theme, one of the challenges that organizations have, right? They turnover, right? Turnover tends to be a little bit of a challenge. And while we know that, turnover happens, it happens more to some people than others. As people are engaging, companies engage with Sandler, how do we handle the concept of training people into the organization, right, as turnover happens, whether that's organic or on purpose, right? New people, right? So we talked a little bit about it, like a 2-year engagement, ongoing reinforcement. And ultimately, in that 2 years, you're going to hire somebody new. How do we deal with that?
Well, and that's the interesting part when we think about the Sandler journey. Because let's just assume for a minute you've got a corporate engagement where, they've been under contract for a year and they're going to go hire 2 new reps, right? Well, they don't know Sandler. So how do we get them plugged into kind of the infrastructure, right? The kind of how we sell. And we're going to do that through a two-day boot camp.
Okay.
Sometimes you might hear us call it a quick start.
Right.
Where it's drinking from a fire hose. Like I'm not gonna like get around that. It is 2 days immersion of Sandler, where you're gonna learn the X's and O's of what Sandler is. Think about it more of like knowing what Sandler is, where the reinforcement program is more about owning what Sandler is.
Yeah. So turnover, for some organizations, it's non-existent, which is awesome. For some organizations, it's rather high. And so, some of the challenges, like people say, well, why would we train these people? I know some of them are going to leave, or we're going to fire some of those folks. I was taught a long time ago that, turnover is it's a reflection on leadership. So when we start to think about that, and maybe that's true, maybe I'm being a little hard on that sort of axiom, but the reality is, if we have somebody in our midst, we have an employee in our midst, the question we have to ask ourselves, if they're not performing, the question we have to ask ourselves is, did we hire them this way? Or did we somehow make them this way?
So we really appreciate you spending some time learning about Sandler, tactics, strategies, the way organizations are really engaging Sandler to impact their teams. If any of this resonated with you, you feel like this warrants a deeper conversation about your team, your organization, we would certainly welcome that.